Call to order the Executive By Board for Tuesday, August 23rd, 2022. Due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, in accordance with Chapter 22 of the Acts of 2022, suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, public bodies otherwise governed by the open meeting law are temporarily relieved from the requirement that meetings be held in public places, open and physically accessible to the public, as long as measures are taken to ensure public access to the body's deliberations through adequate alternative means. This meeting will be live on Zoom. The public may participate remotely by joining Zoom meeting ID number 854-0032-4335 or by calling 929-205-6099. For additional information about remote participation, please contact Carly Antonellis, Assistant Town Manager at ATM at Ayer.ma.us or 978-772-8220 extension 100 prior to the meeting. Welcome, Fred. Thank you for giving us quorum for today.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. No worries at all. All right, so we've called to order, and the first item of business is just review and approval of the previous meeting minutes for July 26th. I have no issues.
None.
No.
I'll make a
Okay.
motion to approve.
Second.
All right, I will roll call the vote. Ms. Antonellis,
Aye.
Mr. Aponte,
Aye.
Mr. Pomprians,
Aye.
and the chair says aye. Those are approved. And next item, we have an overview of ARPA funding and discussion on spending policy and plan with Ms. Evelyn Martucci, CLA. Welcome, Evelyn. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you.
Hi, Evelyn. This is Robert Pontran, the town manager. We met before. How are you?
Yes, I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. So as we discussed, the town of Ayer, we're in the process of sort of putting together a recommendation for our ARPA funds in terms of a spending policy and a plan. And as you're aware from what we discussed, the town did commit some ARPA funds to two infrastructure projects, one a water project and one a sewer project, which were eligible and high needs of the town. The remaining balance, of course, right now is in the account, as they say. And this group, the By Board, meets to make sort of recommendations to the Finance Committee and to the Select Board on various financial matters. So for the purpose of this afternoon, we're hoping maybe you could briefly give maybe an overview of sort of the ARPA funding in terms of what you can and can't use it for, and any suggestions on your experience related to a potential spending policy or a spending plan. And I know Fred has submitted some stuff which we'll talk about later regarding that. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Yes, I know we did talk about the infrastructure. So yeah, those are both definitely eligible. You know, the good thing is where you have less than 10 million, and I believe the town has elected to take the standard allowance of up to 10 million for the revenue loss funding, because you can, and even if it's infrastructure, you can technically still put that under the revenue loss category, even though there are separate infrastructure categories that you can report them under. Even if it fits in a separate category, if you're taking the standard allowance of the 10 million for revenue loss, you can put them under there as well. So that's just an option. And in doing that, with the spending plan, if you're going to use that standard allowance for the revenue loss, there's a lot of flexibility for what you can use that funding for. So you can use it for what's in those other categories, as well as when you talk about the revenue replacement, it can be any general government type service. And we've had discussions on this. It doesn't even have to be something that the town has done. It could be something that any government could potentially do as a service. So it could be, you know, the snow removal, it can be just general operations, just anything that a regular government service would be. And with doing that, they've also loosened some of the regulations as far as procurement and subrecipient monitoring as well, so that if you're using that revenue loss, it really gives you a great amount of flexibility of how to use that funding. the main things you can't use it for really is for OPEB. You cannot use it to, for debt, the past debt, and anything that would go against the mission of the ARPA funding, right? So we give the example of if you get penalized for not, wearing a mask or vaccine, and then you want to use ARPA funding to pay the penalty, right? You can't do that because it's something that goes against the ARPA. But really, with using that, you have a lot of good flexibility of how you want to use it. And if you're using revenue loss, you don't have to even get into all of the, gathering the income documentation, making sure they're low income. That's more if you're using the negative economic impact or public health categories. But if you're under revenue loss, you don't even have to collect that guidance. You don't have to verify low income. Now, it's definitely a good practice if you want to gear your projects to the low income, but you don't have that same requirement where you have to report that to Treasury and keep that documentation. So it streamlines the reporting and gives you a lot more abilities of how to use that fund.
That was the final rule, right? The final rule.
That
wasn't
is
that the-
absolutely,
yeah.
that is the final rule. That is correct. And it's my understanding, right, you are going to take the 10 million.
We are.
That's because that's how we reported it in the Treasury report. So
Yeah.
if I could, just for everybody's benefit through the chair, the Fred or Evelyn, just maybe if you could just explain a little bit more about the revenue loss calculation, what that is and what that means for the town.
yeah, Fred, do you want me to?
Yeah, I think you'd be better off doing it. Yeah.
Yes. So there was a whole calculation that used to be before the final rule, where you would have to take your base revenue, which in this case would be the 2019 revenue, and then you'd have to calculate the next year's revenue and then do a comparison to figure out. There's a whole big formula that they put in the actual Treasury guidance, where there's a factor you have to apply it, and then it would come out with what they would call as your counterfactual revenue, what you should have gotten, and then you compare that with your actual revenue. And then you could, what you had to do is when you did that, looking at your revenue, there was a whole list of revenues you could not include. So you couldn't include federal grants, you couldn't include any federal pass-through grants. There was just, I think it used to be stabilization was not allowed. There was a whole list of revenues that you'd have to make sure you backed out that you could not include in that calculation. So what they did is, and then what you do is you come down and say, okay, this is what our actual revenue loss is. And then you could use that to use for any kind of governmental expense. But you'd have to prove that calculation, and then you'd have to redo that calculation to see every year, is that still valid, to see how that would change. And 1 year you may have a loss, and another year you may not have a loss. So then you might lose that by doing that calculation every year. What they did with the final rule is, I think they really wanted to make this a lot easier and streamline it for the smaller jurisdictions and places. So what they did is, if your total ARPA allocation is less than 10 million, you can take your full amount of that up to that as a standard allowance without having to even do that calculation. You didn't have to even show what your actual loss amount was. And actually, I should go back. It's open to anybody. So even if you got more than 10 million, you are allowed to take that standard allowance up to 10 million if you wanted to, but then you can't do both. So let's say if you had gotten, 50 million, and you said, you know what, I'm just going to take that 10 million 1 year, you'd have to stick with it. You couldn't change it. You'd have to stay with that. But in your case, you can take your full amount as the standard allowance, and then you don't even have to do that calculation. So they really wanted to make it easier, because people were saying that it was very, administratively burdensome to have to do that whole calculation. So there was a lot of questions, and people were doing it wrong, and Treasury was getting bombarded with questions. So I think what they wanted to do is just make it a lot easier for people to use. So they looked at it like, if you want to take up to 10 million, you don't have to do that whole calculation. And it allows you to use it for anything that could be a government type expense, or even if it's something that you could technically put in a different category, like if it's infrastructure, if it is something public health related, you technically could still put that in that revenue loss bucket.
I was
So they
very
just wanted
happy
to
with the final rule, I have to say. Excuse me, Evelyn. I was just very
Yes.
happy with that.
We were we were jumping up and down. So
Yeah.
yeah, it did make life a lot easier for a lot of people. doing it that way. Does that make sense?
Does to me.
Mhm.
Yeah, so if we could just clarify, I guess revisit, because, we're a few months from our initial discussions around this. How much did the town receive? And I know that we've allocated some portions of it over to the Westford Street sewer project. So what do we have remaining?
See, I mean, in the books right now is a 1.1 million. We just received another 435,000 last month. And I believe it's up to 2.1 million that we're going to receive altogether, I believe.
That sounds
Yeah.
close.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
And I don't, and I know you mentioned these allocations, but I see that nothing, no indication of any of that in our books. So maybe you promised it, but we haven't really given them the money yet, correct?
Right, so
Okay.
my understanding is total is 2.1 million. The select board authorized up to 700,000 on the Westford Road sewer main, and they authorized up to 800,000 on the Spectacle Pond water transmission. I know that, Fred, probably you don't have anything yet because the bills have yet to come, your way. I also know that, and I have to check with the DPW director, that the sewer main project on Westford Road actually came in much lower than anticipated through procurement. So it is actually probably a less amount.
Yeah, I want to allocate it to in the books, so we have everything separated, so we know what the expenses are for, et cetera, and keep better track of it. As long as everybody realizes they need to keep every piece of documentation for every project, no matter how trivial it seems, they've got to keep everything.
Yes.
So so let's say, just for the sake of discussion, there's a 1.2 million remaining. I'll argue it'll be even a little bit higher than that. That's obviously in an interest-bearing account right now.
Not sure.
I think that's what Barbara had indicated. I know that she isn't here.
I believe that was the plan.
Yeah.
Not sure if that, Evelyn, is that doable? I mean, I know we didn't do that in Sterling. I mean, and the interest stays with the account. Is that true?
It is allowable. They do allow this for ARPA. A lot of federal programs you're not allowed to.
Right.
Well, it's funny. Some programs will require it, some will not. Some will say you can, but then if you earn more than 500, you'd have to send back. They don't require that with ARPA. So you are
Good.
allowed to accrue and keep it with the program.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure, I know she's away this week, and Scott mentioned it as well. Pretty sure Barbara has that as we speak, is in an interest bearing account. Evelyn, from your experience, if I can, through the chair, and I know you work with other governmental entities and other municipalities, any thoughts, just for the purpose of discussion, or recommendations, or things to consider in terms of best practices with respect to a spending policy or a spending plan?
So just to reiterate what Fred said, I'm glad he mentioned it, making sure you keep all your documentation, because one thing we're telling everybody is that, this funding will definitely be audited. I don't know if this will might put you into a single audit. I don't know if you typically get single audits, but you might need a single audit, because if you have more than 750,000 of federal expenditures in a year, then you'd have that. So this program, just the nature of it, always gets audited. So to Fred's point, there's a lot of flexibility, but the key with everything is documenting it. You want to make sure you document, why you decided to do that project, how you came up with the dollar amount. We do tell people we love to see infrastructure, because it's great to use it for these big projects that you normally can't do. What we've seen some places do, that maybe some have more funding, is they have a lot of these little tiny projects that they have going on, and you have to report on all of those to Treasury. And it's good if you want to do that. It's good to do various projects, but if you can keep them to maybe some bigger projects that you can't normally do, it's a good use of funds. And it also, I think, just helps streamline some of your reporting and your monitoring and tracking, because we've gotten some places where like cities and towns, like everybody heard, oh, we got this funding. Well, I want to do this project for 5,000. I want to buy this for 10,000. And then you're getting into each one of those is a separate project, right? So each one of those you're going to report separately to the Treasury, which is allowable. You can definitely do that. I'm just thinking if you're thinking of different types of projects, we tend to tell people advocate for some of the bigger ones that you normally couldn't do. Because then you get use of it and just makes your reporting a lot easier for the Treasury. Instead of tracking like 50 different little projects, you have a few bigger ones. But not to say you shouldn't do it, but that's just something we've run into where come reporting time, it turns into be a headache for some people because you're tracking information for like 60 little projects. You know what I mean? So just something that, definitely just to think about. And just try. So yeah, the bigger ones, just documenting. The key thing is just documenting everything, right? And why you're doing what you're doing, because you will be asked why you did that, how you chose it. With doing revenue loss, the good thing is it streamlines what you have to report to Treasury. They don't require as much, but that's not to say the auditors aren't going to ask you for some additional information. So you just want to make sure you have all of that, right on hand and can explain like why you did this project and how you came out with the dollar amount, just things of that nature that you want to think about. The other thing that's come up is procurement and just being cognizant of, the federal procurement sometimes is different than the state procurement. So there's some projects and some purchases that are exempt under 30B that there are no exemptions for the federal procurement. So if you're doing a project over 250,000, for example, and let's say, I'm just going to make this up, it's engineering. Engineering is actually exempt under 30B, but it's not exempt under federal. So you'd still have to do some bids or at least show that you selected a vendor from the statewide contract. And if you select a vendor from a statewide contract, they've already done all of that bidding, right? They've already looked at that. So you can rely on that, but there's also usually a user guide that goes with each one of those. And you just want to make sure you follow that user guide because a lot of them may still require that you get, 3 quotes just to have those. So that's one thing we've seen people get tripped up on. They say, but, we did this as 30B, it's exempt. There's no exemptions under federal. So that's just something to think about if it's that. But the thresholds are actually a little bit higher. So if it's federal, you don't have to do bidding unless it's over 250,000. Whereas with 30B, it would be over 50,000. So if it's not exempt, the state's actually more stringent. But if it's exempt, you just got to follow the federal. So that's another area that we've seen cause some confusion for people in the past. And it's a big topic, and a lot of them are looking at procurement. So, and if ever you have questions on these, we can definitely help you because we get the procurement and all these questions from a lot of places. So we've been looking into them quite a bit. Do you have any other projects in mind, or are you just kind of getting to that?
Yeah, we've had on the initial discussions. I think the scope that was kind of set up in the initial discussions with the buy board was really that there were certain restrictions, the low income piece, the infrastructure for water and sewer specifically, and also I think the other one's like IT infrastructure was the other one that was acceptable.
Broadband.
Like low hanging fruit. Let me ask this question. So specifically, one of the things that comes to mind is our DPW superintendent came to us about a month ago or two. Did the presentation about looking to electrify our vehicle fleet, and part of that infrastructure build out for that would be charging stations for the fleet. Is that something that we could utilize these funds towards?
Yes. Yep, you
Okay.
could definitely put that under revenue. And they actually encourage as part of revenue loss, if you need to buy, that's another big thing. It's a good recommendation too. Like if you need fire engines, if you need ambulances, they actually put that as a good suggestion under the, government services for revenue losses. A lot of people have been buying fire engines, ambulance, police cruisers, if they're falling apart, they're like, we need to get this. So that's something that's a big thing. So I think that could be right in line with that. If you want to get charging stations, I think you could. That would definitely be.
I think the confusion was in the beginning we had the restrictions and everybody's still thinking about those restrictions. And I'm telling people that you pretty much can use it for anything as long as you're not funding your reserves and things like that. It's
Right.
like open.
OPEB,
So, yeah.
debt, that
Yep.
kind of rainy day fund, you can't fund the rainy day fund. But really, yeah, I mean, that's really, like Fred said, when this first came out, before we did the final rule, right, Fred, there was a lot more restrictions on it.
Yeah, it was confusing.
It had to be low income, it had to be different things, but that's only in certain categories. Because you have the luxury to take everything under revenue loss, you don't have to get into all that. So you have a lot more leeway on what you can do. And charging stations and stuff like that all could fall under general government type expense. So you could absolutely do that under revenue loss. The other thing I didn't mention is the time frame. You probably know this, but the period of performance begins March 3rd of 2021, and it goes through December 31st, 2024 has to be obligated by, but you have an additional 2 years to spend anything that's been obligated. So you have until December 31st, 26. This came up actually just in a call I had earlier. They were trying to pay for something for arrears that went back to 2020, because that's technically when the emergency started, but this funding doesn't go back that far. You can only go back to 2021. So it's more of a forward-looking grant, so they don't want to go too far back. So just something else to think about if you're trying to fund anything prior, but that's come up recently.
Thank you. Just a curiosity question, is it possible to partially fund a project? And I'll give the specific example. On capital planning last year, we're anticipating the need for a ladder truck at a cost of, last year it was 1.5 million. Our assumption is that it'll probably be closer to 2 as we get into the next capital phase. Is ARPA funds available to use as a partial funding mechanism for some of these projects or needs?
Yes.
All right,
Yes.
excellent.
What I would
Thank
say
you.
is you just want to make sure you have the vote, that you vote on it, that you've agreed. So if you were doing it 100% ARPA, then you wouldn't necessarily have to have that vote. But we just recommend that you have the vote to prove, okay, we're going to split fund this. X amount is going to come ARPA, X amount is going to come out of capital or whatever other funding. And the other thing is just, as long as you have that split, then you can have that fund. And if you would have, let's say you had other federal grants, I'm not sure if you have a lot of federal grants, but if you wanted to use 2 federal grants for something, you can do that. You just have to be careful, what they call double dip, right? So you just want to have proof that, okay, we didn't use 2 grants for the same expenditure. But that's even allowable too if you had multiple grants, and let's say something was allowable under 2 grants. We see that sometimes. You could have multiple grant funding sources as well, as long as you just prove you're not using it for the same expense, because they will look at that. No, they always ask that question. So, but yeah, you can, if you vote on it and you have proof, you can absolutely, you can have multiple funding.
Great, thank you.
For that.
I think that's all the questions I have. I'll open up to anyone else who may have questions.
Good. I have Evelyn's email and phone number, so I can call her anytime. So.
Yeah, I'm reachable anytime you have any questions. And we do this a lot for clients too. Like if you're looking at something, say, hey, can you just look at this and give us feedback? I do that for a lot of clients where, is this allowable? Is there anything I'm missing? I'll give feedback if you have something that you're looking at, or if you have questions on procurement or anything. So anytime something like that comes up, you can reach out to me.
Thank you.
Right.
All right.
Mr. Chair, I would just offer, just for our purposes in terms of next steps. I know you have mentioned, which I agree, is getting the capital planning committee, to meet in the next month or so before we start the whole capital process, to meet for the purpose of looking at all of the big projects. And I was having similar thinking that you were just having about that ladder truck, that perhaps from that meeting, at least we'll be able to further vet some of the big projects that could be covered either by ARPA or partial. And maybe that would be a good next step as far as putting together, ultimately what the spending plan is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good plan. We're looking at the time frame. We still have another 2 years to the end of 2024 to obligate it. However, I think also looking at what we have down the pipeline for capital, plus, God willing, a elementary school at some point over the next couple of years, we may want to look to give the taxpayers a little bit of a break wherever we can.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other questions or comments for Evelyn?
Thank you, Evelyn.
Thank
Just
you.
one other quick thing I was gonna add, if you have any
Yeah, please.
construction that's over $1 million, I don't know if you have any of that, you just have to have like a written justification on hand, but I don't know if there's any construction over $1 million that you're looking at, but just to mention that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate
Actually,
it.
can I ask a quick question?
Please.
Is there like a form you can recommend, or, we're working on these projects now? Something that, like our DPW manager could, like kind of keep in the file, doing all the justification for it, like any questions that the auditors might ask. If we put them down now, rather than do it when we get audited in 7 years, it might be helpful.
Yes, because you're not gonna remember all that. Yes, we have seen, we have seen some clients that have departmental forms that they've generated where, like to that point, DPW or Parks and Rec or something might send this and say, we want to request this project. We can update it how we want. I can give you kind of like an example of some what other clients have used. And it gives you the name, the dollar amount, and you can just it has a different element, different categories, but you're just going to do revenue loss. So you can just check that off. And it just gives that description of what the project is, why it's necessary. And yeah, I think you could, and that just gets it started, right? And then it gives a place where they sign it, finance signs it.
Carly, the form I sent you guys this morning was from CLA, so.
Oh, okay, good.
Oh, did I already send you one?
No, I forget who I'm working with now in Sterling, and she sent it to me.
Oh,
So
Catherine.
I
Okay, yeah,
use Catherine,
yes, Catherine
yes.
has that too. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay, I see it.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you.
So okay. If you have any questions on that, or if you would like anything else, feel free. But if that makes sense, we can go with that.
Oh, that's good.
Oh, we'll be in touch, I'm sure.
Yes, but that's good to have. That's a good point, because you want to have that backup to show that they requested it, you reviewed it, you approved it, it went through, why it went through. So that's that good. You want that documentation in your files to show how it went from, we kind of want to do this, to yes, we've approved it and we've funded it, right?
Yeah.
So it's a good form, documentation to have on file. So no, it's a good question.
Thanks.
Excellent. So if there's nothing else, Evelyn, thank you very much for joining us here. Really appreciate all the information and answering all of our questions. I 100% guarantee we will be in touch at some point with a multitude of questions as we work through the process. And thank you.
Definitely, that's what we're here for. So reach out anytime.
Thanks, Evelyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Anything else just for discussion around ARPA before we move on to the next item?
I'm good.
Okay. All right, item number 4 on the agenda for today is update on the review of the financial policies. I'll begin this by saying I apologize. I've not had a chance to do another review of them. So mine will come hopefully soon.
Mr. Chair.
And I'll turn it over to Robert for the shaming. Go ahead.
No worries. So first, just to give an overview, as we sent out, we're looking for everybody's comments from the buy board by September 2nd. So we still get some time ideally, and we have some of them, as you saw, we have some of Scott's initial and some that had been from Pat and so forth. So September 2nd, we get everything to the best of your ability as far as initial input. Then obviously we're going to schedule a September buy board meeting, which at that September meeting, we would review in detail the input submitted for September 2nd. And then from there, then submit that version, if you will, to all of the departments for their feedback and input. It still puts us on schedule. The other thing we should think about to consider, I know this had been brought up about having a working session on the policy. So in addition to our normal by-board meeting, perhaps we need to have a working session where we drill down on some of these things. So that's sort of it on the schedule front. From my perspective, I'm almost done my review and looking at a couple of things of that I will have at least for consideration, and that doesn't mean we have to go with that version, but did take an attempt at a proposed UDAG policy was one of the ones that was brought up. Also, I think Scott had brought that up. Also, a clarification in dedicated section on the RFT process. And on all of these, I think when we meet at the September meeting, we'll focus on there's some decisions and questions that need to be discussed, you know, so there's the UDAG, the RFT process. I'm gonna look with Carly, who's one of our procurement experts. The procurement section in the financial policy just needs to be updated and clarified, as there's been some changes there. I think we need to look at, I made a note here, we need to have a discussion and look at the capital exclusion, debt exclusion, those thresholds in the capital policy. I'm not saying they need to, I know that the capital ceiling was increased once, but I think we need to look at that. I will have for discussion also looking at the issue of employee compensation. The process piece, and then Scott, you had flagged this in your remarks too. I think that the process piece in the last iteration has been good. I mean, at least we have a process. However, I think we need to review and discuss the issue of the sustainability of wage increases in terms of the COLA. So for example, it's generally been 2% over the last, several years, and the metrics generally fall within that. Some of the metrics fall in that area, but as you probably all heard in the news, they're looking at a Social Security increase, I think, of 10 to 12%, for next year. And I'm not begrudging that, but do we need to have some further flesh that out further as far as the sustainability on the COLA front? And it was the cannabis issue. I think we should also further discuss whether the working group here is what do we do with the, that funding. And not to belabor the point, there was one other, I have, as the five boards aware, the town adopted that compensated balances. Town meeting approved the fund for compensated balances where the town can, pay out separations and so forth. We'll have a draft policy for that because that's something new. So that's just a highlights from my end. I'll get it all organized and clear on a one-pager for September 2nd. And I just think there'll be some room for further discussion and decisions by this group as far as the final recommendation goes.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Any other questions or comments on the financial policies? Okay. So moving on, number 5, review and discussion of the draft fiscal year 2024 budget calendar.
And Mr. Chair, I'm going to turn it over to the Assistant Town Manager, who I think will have a shared screen as well to sort of provide an overview for this discussion.
Yeah, so I dared to do something different this year. Instead of the calendar format,
What?
I actually listed it because honestly, the calendar can be challenging with the formatting. But for me, I could see this. I'm gonna pull it up. It was much more concise and on 3 pages instead of 10 pages. So let me just pull this up. But I'm obviously open to feedback. So how I did it was, there's still stuff to populate, obviously. But what I did was just kind of take the major important stuff. And then my plan was to kind of keep it as a living document, if you will, and check off things as we go. So it'd be easier for people to follow along. So it's pretty self-explanatory, I would guess, but the things that aren't on there are obviously the rate. There's a couple rate reviews mentioned. The buy board meetings are not here. And then just other meetings, but this is kind of how I organized it for now. All leading up until May, when we have the town election. And then I know we had kind of talked about budget forms and what we wanted to do moving forward on those, given the low participation that we get, but I added those in kind of like we did the same timeframes. I made sure that the March one was pushed sooner in March because we had a request for that this year. So rather than having it at the end of the month, have it more in the beginning. So I don't know if you love it or hate it, but it kind of made more sense to me to lay it out this way, but I can certainly put it back on the calendar. So that's what I got for now.
Love the icons.
Thanks.
Carly,
Little
could you send that to everybody on the
Yep.
buy board so they can, take a look at it?
Yep.
Please, thank you.
All right. So I know you mentioned the rate review committee needs to be input on that. Capital planning, Robert, you and I need to finalize when we're going to start meeting and what our cadence will be around that. From the format change, I agree that it definitely is more concise and makes sense. I'm a big proponent of the calendar look, but I also understand it is a monster to manage because I actually manage something similar for my closed calendars here at work. So I'll go either way. I'm happy with trying the new format for a year, see what we get for feedback. And we can regroup next year and see if the new format works better, or if we want to go back to the old format.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, I use Microsoft Publisher to do it with the calendar format, and I'm very comfortable on the computer, obviously, but the calendar for some reason gives me a lot of trouble.
Well, fair enough.
But anyway.
Yeah, it's not worth a monumental effort into just to make a list for a presentation. If the list format is easier to manage going forward, and it's usable for the people who are impacted by it, then let's work with that.
Yeah, okay. Great, and then, so capital, and then
Rate review.
rate review, buy board.
Yep.
Those are the major ones we got to fill in.
And also finance committee, once they get their schedule
Right.
set.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, to echo Scott, Carly, good job. I think that as many of our efforts, we try to do things and get feedback and so forth. So I think we should try this new format. We've got to populate it some. We'll get some, and we can revisit like we do everything. But thank you for putting that together. And as I mentioned before, we're looking for the select board to ultimately approve the calendar by their first meeting in October at the latest, has generally been the case. And the second piece, I think, related to that, what we need to look at a little more, and Carly mentioned it, is just the two pieces is the time between the budget presentations from the feedback, which we've discussed, and our perennial challenge, which we'll eventually, I think, find the right stride for, is the compression with the arrival of town meeting, in April. So I think those are just two areas for further discussion. But thank you for beginning to shape that.
Yeah, just one quick comment on the budget forms, thinking about it since our last meeting, I think having at least one presentation is definitely worthwhile. But
I agree, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, and I don't know, wondering if we do like the initial budget presentation after, but not like, I think the hard part is really finding that sweet spot where it's like either you present it first and it's too early and there's a lot of changes, or if you present it towards the end, people feel like they were out of the loop on a lot of what goes on.
Right.
But doing basically one presentation, but then doing just documentation that's on the town website that says this is the change to the budget over the last 2 to 3, 2 weeks since the last version or whatever. That way we at least have the information available without having to do the full presentation. And then it's just a single presentation. At one point, we can discuss it as we get closer to that as to what the best layout is for that.
I agree with Scott. I think that having the public presentation, especially that first one, obviously is of importance and of value. And as Scott mentioned at our last meeting, which he alluded to again now, I think the idea of this budget tracking system that you talked about, and maybe some of us, Fred, you and I, that documents and clearly shows those changes through the process, I think is an interesting and positive step in that. And I would just offer this too, not to bring up, the past and so forth, but with the reconstitution of the new FinCom, hopefully, what was missing at least last year in the budget process was the Finance Committee was not meeting regularly either, reviewing and meeting with departments. So hopefully with the new FinCom, that'll be a piece as well, to add to it. But I think we should, Fred and Scott and Carly and others, we should begin to start to think about, the budget format and incorporating how do we want to track or illustrate those changes.
So when I was on the committee and we were doing basically we had our own budget file that we were doing in parallel, we would build out with what the initial request was and then just build the columns out to the right, so we'd have, basically, and I can try and find one of the formats that I had, it's basics, Excel spreadsheet, similar to the way that Lisa had compiled the detailed budget. But as you would from left to right on the columns, you'd have your first iteration, then you'd have, updates as of like a set time, and it would show you like the plus or the minus, like this went up $2,500, and then give you a new total to work with. So you could basically, it allowed the committee to step through each change within the budget process as we went through it. So in the end, we would have probably, I think like 7 or 8 columns with different changes to the budget. And it gives that good vision of one on timing of when certain things have changed, but also, you can clearly see the budget moves, say like $25,000, I know that's, or say $100,000 since the last iteration. You can look in a specific column, you can see exactly what that movement was, pluses and minuses.
Yeah, Scott, and I'll check too, if you come across, and I'm sure I have one too, a sample.
I have a Dropbox that I used when I was on the committee, and I think I started purging it like a month ago. I don't recall if I saved any of the old versions of the budgets, though. They all, we're like talking like 2012, 2013. So
yeah,
I figured it was safe to let those go.
And I think, not to get way off topic, but it's sort of related to this in terms of the budget process. I think once the Finance Committee is constituted and in place, at one of their initial meetings, I feel that some of us should go to provide sort of a general overview of the budget process as it exists now and sort of what the FinCom's role is in that. Because I know we're going to have pretty much almost all new people. And I just think it's important right from the beginning that we are all on the same page in terms of the process. I'm sure there'll be, as there always is, differences of substantive opinion on issues, but I think it's imperative that we're all on the same track as far as the schedule.
Yeah, when I was on the committee, I think it was when I was John Kilcummins, Brian Muldoon, and I forget who else was on with us at that time. I think it was maybe Andrew. I had the committee, we went through, we created the mission statement that's on the town website, and it's more of a, it's kind of that general guidance as to like what we're trying to accomplish, but I do think they need some context on what their options are. And every board is going to be, in committee is going to be different from past iterations. So, you know, I'm happy to meet with them and say, you know, basically spell like, well, when I started, this is how things were, this is how it morphed in my time and why. And then, you know, basically leave them with that knowledge so they can make their choices as a board as to what they want to do.
Yeah, it sounds good. I think it should be a goal of ours for September to meet with the FinCom. I know there's another selection vetting meeting this week, and I'm sure the moderator will probably be making some appointments shortly, and then we'll have a sense of who all the members are and can move in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's really, you know, my opinion is very important that we have a strong finance committee, especially people who understand what's being requested and would absolutely support working with them, however, for whatever they need. Make sure that they're getting up to speed as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
All right. So that's all we have for number 5 on the agenda. Next item is new business. We don't have anything listed. Is there anything with anyone on the phone to discuss?
Nope.
I have a question.
Hi, Sarah. How are you today?
Good. When you guys were just talking about the finance committee and the select board and the budget process, I do remember, like, in past years, you guys have had multiple sessions, like presentations. Are you guys talking about moving the process more to the finance committee? Like, is there going to be more opportunities, like, after the presentation is delivered?
So generally, the way things have worked in the past is that the budget process has been kind of done in parallel, but also in coordination with each other. So from the select board side, our process will not change with how we're going to go through the budgeting process. However, with the ability to have an active and viable finance committee in this budget round, it's really going to be up to the committee to decide if they want to have the department meetings that we used to have in the past, so that they can, you know, the example I've always given is, you know, when we discuss the budget at a select board, we usually have about 15 to 20 minutes allocated to the entire budget. Whereas the finance committee can have the fire department in, and they can spend an hour just discussing, not necessarily like the numbers, but kind of more of like what the department does and what their challenges are. So it's a lot more fruitful information that's in detail. And then the finance committee also has the right, if they choose, if they disagree with something on the budget that the select board is putting together, to really document that, and they can provide that information to the taxpayers and also the town meeting.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Sarah. All right, so next item is to schedule our next meeting. So we've been doing, we're on what, the second or the second to last Tuesday of the month?
Yeah, so, Mr. Chair, so in looking at it, as far as the next meeting could be September 27th. We could have the next regular meeting, and I just sort of put in parentheses, maybe before that, maybe like a September 13th or something, if we wanted to go with the working group on the policies. And we don't have to iron that out right today,
Yeah.
but I was thinking September 27th.
That can work for me.
Oh, go ahead, sorry. On my calendar, though, I populated it with the second Tuesday of the month. I think we
Oh.
discussed that at some point.
Okay, I mean, we could do,
Okay.
we
The
could do the,
13th would work then.
I can change it, but I think we did have this discussion a couple.
Yeah. No, let's do, my 2 cents would be, let's do the 13th, and then from
Okay.
that, if we need another meeting for September, we could hold the 27th. So let's look at let's do the 13th at 2 on Zoom.
All right, that
Okay.
works for me. Is there anything for the fall town meeting that executive by board needs to discuss?
As of right now, it doesn't appear to be anything with significant financial. There may be 2 CPC articles, one for the affordable housing and one for the cannon on town hall ground.
Howitzer, but okay.
There's a couple zone howitzer, yes, 1943 howitzer. There's a street acceptance and 2 potential small zoning bylaw changes, but I'm not aware of anything. Fred, are you at this point of anything financial?
Not yet, no.
Yeah, but
Okay.
Scott, to that point, we'll keep you updated as if something does present itself.
All right, thank you. Okay, so last item is a adjournment of the executive by board for today.
I make a motion that we adjourn.
Second,
Okay, I will roll call the vote. Mr. Aponte,
Aye.
Ms. Antonellis,
aye.
Mr. Pombriand,
Aye.
and the chair says aye. Thanks, everyone, for your time today.
Okay,
Have
see you
a
later.
Wonderful
Yeah.
afternoon.
Thank you all.
Bye.